What the heck?
Trigon.
Okay, so it's time to finally go back to studying the little facets of Euler's formula, as opposed to his other constant, his oily macaroni constant, for those of you in the know. And we're going to finally cover what it is to put complex inputs into the trigonometric functions, and we're going to see where that leads us. From there, we're going to derive the hyperbolic trigonometric functions, and then after I've finally done that, I'm going to show how they're analogously related to the trigonometric functions, some things that they have that are very well related to each other, how they are interpreted with the unit hyperbola in the xy plane. What else? And then eventually, like I did with the videos of how to actually sort of just deduce the trigonometric function graphs, I'm going to do the same for the inverse trig functions, the hyperbolic trig functions, the inverse hyperbolic trig functions, and then what I'm going to do is, given the complex representation of sine and cosine, or the trig functions in general, I'm going to deduce the first three logarithmic versions of the inverse trig functions and the logarithmic versions for the inverse hyperbolic trig functions, which will also be defined in terms of the exponential function, just as it happens without the imaginary bits. And so to start, all we're simply going to do is plug in a complex number input into the sine function and the cosine function. This is totally valid. It makes perfect sense. If you do a little bit of complex analysis, studying Cauchy-Riemann equations and Liouville's theorem, you can see that all of the functions that we really, really love are differentiable everywhere, but because they're not constant, they must all diverge at some point on the complex plane. So those that we already know, like e to the x and ln of x, we already know they diverge down to negative infinity for ln of x and positive infinity and up to positive infinity for e to the x. But the ones that don't, apparently, like the sine and cosine, as you go off into the imaginary section of their inputs, as opposed to just the real numbers, you see that they do in fact diverge, and this is where we're going to get the definition of the hyperbolic trigonometric functions from. So let's start just by plugging in x plus iy into the sine function. So just to quickly cover all the stuff that we already know, so we understand e to the I theta equals cosine of theta plus I times sine of theta, and naturally the complex conjugate of that, which happens to also be the reciprocal, is cosine of theta minus I sine of theta, and from that we were able to derive the complex exponential versions of sine and cosine, right? So sine of theta is equal to e to the I theta minus e to the negative I theta divided by 2i, and cosine of theta is equal to e to the I theta plus e to the negative I theta divided by 2. Right? That's what we were able to show. And if you square this and add it to the square of that, you will get 1. If you take the derivative of that, you will get this. If you take the derivative of this, you will get the negative of that, just like we expect for trigonometry. But now what we're going to do is simply consider what happens when we plug in a complex number to one of these functions. So let's take a look at the sine function first. So we're going to erase all the Euler's formulas, even though they're the stars of the show, and we're simply going to plug in, we're going to consider, using that original, that complex definition of sine that I just showed you, and also the angle sum formula for sine, we're going to consider what sine of a complex number z is. So z is of course equal to x plus iy. But remember, we also have the angle sum formula for the sine, so we can write this in terms of the sine and cosine of both of these things. So this is equal to the sine of the first one. Why can I not draw ends? The sine of the first one, so x, times the cosine of that input, so times the cosine of iy, plus the cosine of the first one, times the sine of I times y. Now, what the f do these mean? Right? What does it mean to take the cosine or sine of an imaginary number? What angle? Like, that's saying that we have an imaginary angle? Like I've said, or like other, if you've ever taken a complex analysis course, your intuitions kind of have to go out the window once you talk about complex numbers, because you need 4 dimensions to visualize it, and you just kind of have to follow where the analysis takes you. So because this is definitely what the sine is over the complex numbers, right? So let's quickly consider the complex versions of these now. So sine of I times y is going to be equal to, we're plugging in I times y where we saw theta before in the complex definition. So we have e to the I times iy minus e to the negative I times iy all over 2i. right? Well, now we can simplify this, and we get e to the negative y, and negative I times I, those things are actually reciprocals, so we're just going to get e to the y. So we get minus e to the positive y over 2i. And now what we're going to do is, because 1 over I is negative I, we can just bring the I up top and switch this difference here. So instead of that, it's e to the y minus e to the minus y. This looks a lot like the definition of the sine function in the complex form, but without all of the i's. And this, my friends, is our hyperbolic sine of y, written S-I-N-H, but it's being multiplied by I, so we're simply going to plug in I times the hyperbolic sine here. But you'll notice something. All I have to do is divide both sides by I, and we get this relationship, which is to say that the hyperbolic sine of y is equal to negative I times the sine of IY. And when I get to doing the actual picture of a hyperbola, right, and showing how these things are related, it will become clear that this is an amazing relationship, that relating the circle to the hyperbola in this sense is very, very neat. So let's do the same thing with the cosine of IY now. So we know that we're replacing sine of IY by I times the hyperbolic sine of y. So this is getting replaced, sine of IY times the hyperbolic sine of y times I, right? And now let's consider that for cosine. So cosine of I times y is equal to e to the I times IY plus e to the minus I times IY divided by 2, right? Same simplifications, we end up with e to the minus y plus e to the y all over 2, and we can simply flip the sum because sums are commutative, and here we have our definition of the hyperbolic cosine of y, which is of course, just by coincidence, equal to cosine of IY. So if you plug in a purely imaginary number into cosine, you will get the hyperbolic cosine evaluated at real numbers. And if you do minus I times the sine evaluated at a purely imaginary number, you will get exactly the hyperbolic sine of y. So we know that cosine of I times y is equal to the hyperbolic cosine of y. And these are the parts of the function that are going to diverge, right? This number diverges as when you see the functions, it'll be clear. But because there's no I here causing it to be periodic, you know that e to the y is going to diverge as y gets bigger and bigger. So that's sort of where the fact that the sine function and the cosine function actually diverge at some point on the complex plane, because they are both differentiable everywhere and clearly not constant. So they're not part of the functions that Liouville's theorem describes, which say that if you have a function that is bounded and differentiable, then it must be constant on the complex plane, which is clearly not the case, because even on the real number line, sine and cosine oscillate, so they're not constant. And basically the same idea is going to happen here with the cosine of z, which is going to be the cosine of x plus I times y, and we're going to do the same thing with the cosine sum formula. This is equal to the cosine of x times the cosine of IY minus the sine of x times the sine of IY. But we already know what these two things are equal to, so we can simply replace them. The cosine of x times the hyperbolic cosine of y. This is equal to I times the hyperbolic sine of y, so we still just get minus I times the sine of x times the hyperbolic sine of y. This is sine of z and cosine of z, the complex valued versions of the functions. But this sort of highlights a half-even, half-oddness of cosine and sine, because we know that cosine of negative x is equal to cosine of x, right? And we know that the sine of negative x is equal to negative sine of x, right? That's because this is an even function and this is an odd function. But if we do the halfway between negative 1 and 1, which is of course I, right, the square root of negative 1, we get these fanciful equations, right? We know that cosine of I times x is therefore the hyperbolic cosine of x, like we just saw, and we know that the sine of I times x is equal to I times the hyperbolic sine of x. But if we then plug in another I for both of these, thus making this negative 1, we end up with hyperbolic cosine of I times x, which has to give us cosine of x. So it sort of comes back around. And if we plug in another I in for x here, we're going to end up with I times sine of x, which is negative sine of x. So doing the halfway step, which is I, twice, which will make negative 1, gets us right back to where we started. So this is almost like whatever's halfway between odd and even. It almost seems to like reflect that in a way, and it's very, very neat, and I like that a lot. Now, so these are our complex functional definitions of sine and cosine, and they work very, very well. They're perfectly differentiable everywhere. They are entire functions. And what we're going to do now is quickly do a little investigation of these functions. So we know that sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. So when we're checking to see if this is actually true with our complex exponential versions, we just need to square cosine. So we get e to the I theta plus e to the negative I theta all over 2, and we're squaring that. And we just need to add it to the square of the sine, which is e to the I theta minus e to the negative I theta all over 2i, and we're squaring that. When we square this, we get e to the 2I theta plus 2, right? Because we square the first term and then add 2 times the product of the two terms. Since these are reciprocals of each other, their product is 1, multiplying by 2 just gives 2. Adding to the square of the second term, which is e to the minus 2I theta all over 4, because that's 2 squared, plus e to the 2I theta. Since it's a negative, it's minus 2, and that's again plus e to the negative 2I theta. And since we are squaring the bottom, we get 2I squared, which is negative 4, right? And now we're going to use this negative to turn this into a minus, so we can then combine it all into one fraction. And if we distribute this minus onto this stuff, we end up with minus that, and minus that. And I think that you can see, since we have the same denominator and we can combine them, we have the negatives of the terms here, we have these negatives here, so they will cancel, and we will be left with 2 plus 2 over 4, which is of course 4 over 4, which is of course 1. So this is correct, right? We know that cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1. And all I want to show now is that our definitions of the hyperbolic functions behave in the way that the unit hyperbola does, right? Because the unit circle is defined by this characteristic, right? Which means we know that the cosine function and the sine function satisfy this relationship. And essentially the unit hyperbola is defined by this relationship, where the difference of the y-coordinates and the x-coordinates squared is constant. And we're going to show that the hyperbolic sine and cosine do satisfy this relationship. So we're going to prove this fact here, that the hyperbolic cosine of squared of x minus the hyperbolic sine squared of x equals 1. So we just have to go back to our definitions that we learned before. We're taking e to the x plus e to the minus x over 2, which is clearly just the, by the way, this is clearly just the average of e to the x and its reciprocal e to the negative x. So that should give us a very clear hint about how to graph this. Minus e to the x minus e to the minus x over 2 all squared, right? And this is just simply half the difference of the exponential functions. And so when we square these out, we end up with no i's anymore, right? So you could actually think of the hyperbolic functions as just the trigonometric functions without any of the complex values, no i's involved. And so if we square these out, we get e to the 2x plus 2, again, because these are reciprocals, multiplying them together gives 1, you multiply by 2 and you get 2, plus e to the minus 2x, and since these both have the same denominator of 2, I can write it all over 4. Before we had negative 4 in one of the denominators, and it's going to be minus e to the 2x minus 2 plus e to the minus 2x. And it's not too hard to see that minus that is going to cancel with that, and this is going to cancel with the negative of that. Negative times negative 2 is going to give us another positive 2, so we get 2 plus 2, again, over 4, which is equal to 1, right? 4 over 4. So this, in fact, does hold up. The hyperbolic trig functions do, in fact, satisfy the relationship involved with the unit hyperbola. And so in the next video, when we go over how to graph them and how they're related to that function, I'm going to draw those out. But for now, before we move on, because I'd like to have them ready for the next video about graphing them with regards to the unit hyperbola, I just want to state the relationship of the other 4 hyperbolic trig functions. So these are all things that I'm going to tell you that I want you to try and derive on your own. So first of all, the derivative of the hyperbolic sine is actually the hyperbolic cosine. And the derivative of the hyperbolic cosine is not the negative of the hyperbolic sine, it is again the hyperbolic sine. So unlike the trig functions where they alternate sine, cosine, negative cosine, and then it starts over, this only has an alternating period of 2. So the derivative of hyperbolic sine is hyperbolic cosine, and the derivative of hyperbolic cosine is hyperbolic sine. Likewise, the hyperbolic tangent function is equal to hyperbolic sine divided by hyperbolic cosine. The hyperbolic cosecant is equal to 1 divided by the hyperbolic sine. The hyperbolic secant is of course equal to 1 over the hyperbolic cosine, and naturally the hyperbolic cotangent of x is equal to 1 over the hyperbolic tangent, which is equal to hyperbolic cosine over hyperbolic sine. So I just wanted to quickly cover those relationships. Perhaps you should try to figure out from the definitions that we have of hyperbolic cosine and hyperbolic sine from earlier on in the video, try to see what all of these are going to look like as exponential functions, right? Written out in the exponential form, because they will do that. There is also, when we get to the unit hyperbola, there is also analogous lengths on the unit hyperbola that will be equal to these lengths, just like there were on the unit circle with regards to all of the trigonometric functions that I showed way back when I did those videos. So I've finally gotten to talking about the hyperbolic functions. I hope that this satisfies Mr. Hal over 9000. Very clever name you've got there, sir, or ma'am. But from here on out, I'm going to cover the graphs of these things, the graphs of the inverse trig functions, the graphs of the inverse hyperbolic trig functions, how it's related to the unit hyperbola, and how the input of these functions is related to the hyperbola in the same way that the angle inside of the unit circle is related to the unit circle, and it's all going to be covered in the next video. So thank you very much for watching. If there's anything that I forgot to cover with regards to these, please do let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.